we've been at this about 1.5 years, I guess. And it really sort of was born out of, we both come out of advertising. He was an art director. I was a copywriter. Then we both became strategists and researchers. And now he runs marketing for a university. And I run a little consultancy where we do strategy work, but it's grounded in qualitative research primarily. So we teamed up because we were just sort of, some of it was like, it's the pandemic, you want to do something.
Right.
And some of it was like, we both had a bone to pick with like receiving strategy and questions from clients and things like that that were very grounded in like generations as a demographic that they could like target.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, it's like 80 million people. That's a lot of people to call a single audience.
Yeah.
It's not really a single audience. So part of what we started out doing was just sort of, where did this story about millennials even come from? Who coined the term, all of that sort of stuff. And it's, who those people are. But the kind of evolution of it now is like, okay, we're just watching the sort of stories on a loop,
mm-hmm.
and they're getting repeated in slightly different ways for Gen Z.
Mm-hmm.
The, Meet Gen Alpha decks have started to drop, and guess what? They're digital natives. It's that kind of stuff is happening.
Totally.
It's like, oh, thank you, Morning Consult.
Mm-hmm.
This is awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And so, a lot of what I think we're trying to do is just sort of trouble the narratives about what a generation is
mm-hmm.
and whether it's really a thing. But also, I think it has started to feel like the stakes are actually pretty high. Like in our kind of immediate commercial world, brands make decisions on the reliance that these things are real.
Yeah.
and they really should stop.
Yeah.
And we tell our clients not to do that, but like, it's hard to unmoor from those habits. But I think there's also there's policy implications, there's media coverage implications. I have an example from over the weekend with some stuff about multi-generational living in like the Vox Today Explained podcast and then on their website. And it's kind of like, it's very interesting, the frame you used, when that's not really either what the anecdote you used or what the data you're relying on says. It's very much like slacker millennials moving back in with their parents, when actually increasingly it's like older people moving in with their adult children.
Yeah.
So like, and just like, you have a diverse population, you're going to get more diversity of cultural norms around intergenerational households anyway. But so our kind of aim is to sort of say it does matter. It matters for a lot of different things. And so we should be a lot more careful about how we use them if we're going to use them at all. So to that end, we've been talking to people about a variety of different angles on it. And it's been, we talked to Kim Parker from Pew Research. We talked to, this episode's not out yet, but Rob Harvilla about music and who gets to own the 90s, which was a great conversation. We talked to Rebecca Jennings from Vox about slang. And, so we kind of keep having these interesting conversations. And you have been on our list for a very long time because of your book about burnout, and also just like your ongoing writing. And I did have you and Amanda Mull's voice in my head this morning while I was making breakfast, listening to you talk about Stanley Cups.
It was a very millennial conversation, I think. So, yeah.
I do want to say, like, the perfect companion to that conversation and Amanda's piece and The Atlantic is Kyle Chayka wrote a thing about the guy who came from Crocs to work at Stanley.
Yep.
Because I'll just say, like, one of the things working in advertising and marketing for a long time is somehow advertising is the industry that no one wants to talk about directly.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about like advertising showing up on platforms and publishers, but not the billions of dollars spent on people like Adam and me making ads and like how those decisions get made. So it was kind of like, no, it was this guy. He has a thing that he does. It's make it in lots of colors and do celebrity influencer partnerships. That's the thing he does. And it worked really well here. But the bigger conversation around status and class and hydration and wellness and all of those things is amazing. And then I think about, I don't know, around the time that you were doing your piece about trad wives, I had stumbled upon them for a project I was doing for a social media platform and was like, what fresh hell is this? And then came across your piece on it, was like, oh my God, okay. So all of that being said, Adam and I, big fans, been wanting to talk to you for about anything you want to talk about for quite a while. But I think you and I had a good back and forth about things you are interested in talking about, and I think they are compelling and interesting. And I think, one of the things I think a lot about is every time I'm reading, sociology books or ideas industry books or whatever, where they want to talk about millennials or Gen Xers or whatever, it feels like we're actually still talking about boomers, that we are describing other generations in juxtaposition to boomers.
Yes.
And you had a thing about, understanding what makes millennials and Gen Xers different. What do they have in common with other generations? And so maybe that's like a good place to start, because I feel like the social media universe has come for Gen Xers at long last. In like the last year or so, we're getting memes about drinking out of garden hoses and stuff. And
I also drink out of a garden hose, to trouble that distinction.
Yeah, exactly. And so maybe like before we get to the I should also say at the very beginning, when we first started making this show, we used to do kind of a gag where Adam would introduce himself and say that he was Generation X, and I would use something else because I'm born at the very end of 76. And so get to be in that Jordan Catalano, Oregon Trail, blah, 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 exennial generation. So we'll talk about that separately. But maybe let's just start with, in the work you do and the conversations you're having and things you're thinking about. I think there was an easier juxtaposition between millennials and Gen X earlier, when Gen X were slackers and millennials were overachievers getting trophies. And so, what's changed? Where are we now in the kind of current distinction drawing between Gen X and millennials?
Oh, I think so much of it has to do with, one, having kids, and then two, your parents aging. So I think that millennials are joining Gen Xers in that like sandwich generation slot, which goes on for a very long time. Like that's the thing, right? Like your parents are there oftentimes for a very long time. And oftentimes they can be ailing or in need of care or extra attention for a long time. And then your kids, God willing, like they also are around for a very long time. So you don't stop having these needs, these dual draws on your attention. I think the other thing physically is like millennials starting to feel old. And that's like Gen Xers are like, welcome to the freaking club, you weirdos. And I think Gen Xers have felt old for much longer, right? Like more like they had wisdom for longer. And then also just like joining the discourse club of like periomenopause and menopause and like my body's doing this weird thing. And like, let's talk about colonoscopies and prostates and just aging body things, right? So I think that opens it a little bit. And then the other piece is financial. And I think, I wrote about this a while ago about millennials feeling many millennials feeling unsteady in their generational identity, in part because of, for older millennials in particular, arriving at a place where they had some amount of savings that intersected with low interest rates and an okay real estate market that allowed them to become homeowners. And I'm one of those people, right? So like, I feel like owning a home feels very unmillennial, even though there were millions and millions of millennials who have owned homes for a long time. But right, like that understanding, I will never own a home, had become foundational to many millennials. And so joining that club of relative wealth stability, it happened later in life for most millennials, but it happened, right? So like, who does that mean you are now? And I think that millennials either associate that with being Gen X or with their parents, right? And I think like, there's always this criticism that Gen X gets erased from these generational conversations. And first, it's true. It often does get erased. And some of that has to do with just size numbers, right? But if boomers, I think that there was a period of time over the last, I don't know, let's say 15 years, where there were a ton of boomers still in media, still in positions of power, still, especially in things like television, right? Who were still like leading these conversations. And then you had the upstart millennials who were willing to work for a lot less and who were controlling a different sort of conversation. And to them, and this is like, it's not a smart conversation, but it happens this way, is that like you often, when you think of like the types of people that are in the world, there's like your peers and your parents.
Yeah.
And your babysitter gets lost in that mix. So like your babysitter's generation is Gen X, right? If you're a millennial.
Right. Right.
So that, I think that's part of how that conversation got lost. And now I think there's a lot more sympathy with like, oh, interesting. Now, like I'm getting clowned on by Gen Zers, right? Or like, just feeling like you have more in common with boomers or with Gen Xers than you ever felt like you had before. And again, a lot of this has to do with like class position, where you lived in the United States, your level of like onlineness, the type of jobs that you do. Like there's so many different things that can like make you feel more at home in a different generational stereotype.
So I remember that piece because it was interesting to me to think about like, if you actually get past the things you were supposedly by generation never going to do. You're never going to own a home. You were never going to have kids. You're never going to get married. You're never going to do these things, right? That when you start to do those things, like, you know, are you even a millennial now? Right. Whereas I think like, and of course it persists as this idea, like I was listening to, I don't know, Pod Save America or something yesterday or the day before, whatever day it was. What day is it today? Tuesday. So it must have been last week, maybe. They were talking about this like problem of millennials buying homes. And I'm like, but I looked at some data recently and we're over half of millennials as homeowners now. Yeah. Like more than half of millennials own a home.
Barely. It's like barely over half. Yeah.
It's barely over half, yes. But we have like crossed a threshold. Yes. The sliding age of first-time homeownership, that didn't start with millennials. Boomers bought their first homes later than their parents' generation did. Like this has been kind of going on since, since the end of the Second World War. There's sort of like this weird flash in the pan moment. I'm increasingly convinced that basically it's not unlike the argument in Here Comes Everybody and Remix and some of those books from earlier in the aughts about like the broadcast era being and the media consolidation era being this kind of cultural anomaly, historically speaking. Like the post-World War II suburban order is a cultural historical anomaly. This is not how we lived before. It's clearly not how we're going to live again. And it was
facilitated by like a very specific global situation and also by massive federal aid that assisted white people, in particular white GIs, buying their homes and going to school, right? So like just seismic shifts that often are attributed to pulling yourself up by your bootstraps post-war and are actually like working hard, usually with trauma from the war, but with a significant life-altering government assistance. You know,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And so there's this, I think it's interesting to think about, maybe we'll just sort of stay with the homeownership thing for a moment, because like I said, I was listening to Today Explained and then read the piece that it was associated with it about multi-generational living. And they have this anecdote about a 23-year-old young woman in, I want to say Nashville, who is feeling like she will never own her own home. And I will say, as a late stage Gen Xer, Xennial, whatever, that I have been baffled my entire adult life by the idea of being 25 and going, I will never own a home. Like at 25, I did not expect to own a home. That was not like, I don't know, maybe again, like my cultural reference points are so steeped in like recession, stock market crashes, high interest rates, et cetera, that I just am like, what do you mean own a home at 25? Who told you that? Who told you that was going to happen? But the interesting thing about the anecdote with this particular young woman is she's a college grad, I think with an advanced degree already. So she's already gone back and gotten her master's. She's working in nonprofit. She's making $50,000 a year, which I say, wow, working in nonprofits, making $50,000 a year sounds
That's pretty bad.
Yes, because of the cost of the housing market. But here's the other fun thing. Her parents, at least one of her parents, is from Somalia. And she used her savings, as did her siblings, to help her parents buy the house that they now all live in together. And I found myself thinking, if I were doing that interview for a client and then writing up the report about what we learned, it would be more about this multi-generational living where multiple generations are pooling their resources to survive expensive housing markets. But it's not the case that she's not a homeowner. She's a partial homeowner.
She is a partial homeowner. That's so interesting. Home. Well, and the difference is that oftentimes parents give their kids money for down payments, or at least that's the story that we hear, or grandparents or inheritance or whatever. And this is the difference here is just that the family owns one home instead of two homes, right? She is still a homeowner through combining her wealth with her parents.
Yes, but she also clearly, in her own description of her experience, she is relying on the story. The story is, I'm 23 and will never own my own home. And so I feel like a slacker. I feel like I'm living in this weird situation with my parents and blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of if I were her therapist, it would be let's reframe this.
100%.
You helped them buy this house.
And I'm actually kind of surprised by that attitude, because I think that what I hear a lot more of, and this might just be my readership, is the system is broken, so let's figure out different ways to work the system, right? Let's buy a house with my friend. Let's, let's figure out co-living situations in different capacities.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's clearly lots of data to support that people are doing that more and more. And you even see it occasionally reflected in marketing, for that matter. I think there's a Coinbase ad that has, a group of Gen Zers who get together and buy a house. But the story that we want to tell, and by we, I guess I mean anybody over 45 wants to tell about anybody under 30, is that, you are worse off than your parents, which is a story that was told in media about Gen X. I'm pretty sure it was a story that was told in parts of the baby boom coming of age period. And it is a recurrent story.
But it's not financially true until you get to the millennials. The millennials are the first generation to be to have less wealth and less than their parents. The millennials reverse the trend.
So I think what I have seen in the data is that it's slower to get to that point. Yeah. It's not that they actually, and obviously that has long-term effects for sure. But it was, the slacker, let's talk about Gen X, because I think this is one of the things that is why Gen X is the way they are about generations. I have a strong, I don't actually believe generations are real. I choose not to buy into this bullshit kind of orientation. But I think it is because I'm at the very end of that generation and got force-fed the stuff about being slackers who would be worse off than our parents. And by the way, we deserved that. And that was the kind of moral accounting narrative, was you guys are going to be worse off, and that's fair for you to be worse off. And so I don't know a lot of Gen Xers who really unless they get to be extremely wealthy. And even then, I've done some interviews with ultra high net worth people who will tell you that they're not rich because they do not own a jet. And that's the next cutoff, that they just haven't crossed that hurdle yet. And so they're not rich yet. But there's kind of an interesting expectations gap, I guess I would say, where I feel a lot of Gen Xers, at least the narrative around Gen Xers, is sort of you just get by. You just sort of survive and make progress, and you do what you're going to do, unless you're, one of the tech bro sociopaths, and then you do a totally different set of things. And they are mostly Gen Xers. And you just kind of keep your head down because no one really wants to deal with you anyway. And so there isn't a lot of, I guess I'd say that there isn't a lot of reckoning with that. You get there when you get there, I guess, is kind of the attitude I have seen amongst Gen X when they get acknowledged at all as being Gen X.
Yeah, that's
and millennials, I
interesting.
feel got sold a bill of goods about how their lives were supposed to go, when they were supposed to achieve certain milestones. And then nothing about the system was set up to enable that.
Well, so, okay, if we think about generations as in some, like, this is very loose because you can be born to a different generation than like the traditional groupings, right? But like many millennials are born to boomers. Many Gen Xers were born to greatest generation. Many Gen Zers are born to Gen Xers, right? Like that's, it kind of, it flips that way, right?
Yeah.
And so it's easy to understand in some ways how Gen Xers learned from their greatest generation parents, like, life's not fair and you got to wait around. And like, if stuff comes to you, then it does, like, deal with it, right? Deal with it. Like you, oh, you have to like live through all this shit, deal with it. And then whereas millennials saw, like, again, we're speaking in broad generalizations, but like millennials saw their boomer parents and were like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to achieve. This is what this is my standard. And when I don't achieve that, when like the means of achieving that are not even there, but no one has told us that like the infrastructure has been disassembled before, like we weren't old enough or we didn't have access to those narratives that like, oh, like the way that we fund public school is no longer the same, right? Like all those sorts of things, like the way that the housing market is regulated, like it all had these effects that made it so that when we entered into the workplace, so much of the responsibility for costs, for education, for housing, for all these different things would fall onto us as individuals, and thus make it so much heavy. Like, it's like we thought we could climb the mountain at the same pace as boomers, and didn't realize that like when we started at the beginning, we'd have like 100-pound pack on our backs. And I would say that this is where you get the argument from people of color or people who grew up working class that they're like, we always knew. Yeah. And it's just that all of these white middle class millennials are coming to terms with what we always knew was true.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think the other thing that's interesting, in looking at the generational definitions is that the longest stretch generation since the turn of the century is Gen X. It's 25 years.
Yeah.
So you could have given birth to someone in your own generational cohort, according to those rules. Yeah. Right. And so I think you do get like the whatever, 64, 65 to 72 Gen Xers more likely born to silent generation, and then like the 73 and laters being the first kids of the oldest boomers. And this is a thing that I think about a lot because my brother is 4 years and 2 days younger than me. And so he is definitely a millennial. I am not. My parents are both definitely boomers. My dad's born in July 46. My mom's born in 1950. 100% boomers. And yet I think about things like my dad's a little bit older. So he had a previous marriage that didn't work out. I have a half sister from that marriage. The 70s were a period of time where they met, they got married, they started a small business. It was not a great time to be a small business owner, in addition to having an employee who apparently was embezzling from them. They went through an early personal and business bankruptcy, blah, 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 blah. And I think the other thing that people forget is how terrible the early 80s were economically.
My mom, well, I don't forget because my mom is constantly telling me about the mortgage rate that she had on their first house, which they bought when I was in like either 1980 or 1981. Either I was about to be born or had just been born. And I mean, like 12%.
Yes.
I don't know. Like
12 and 13% was pretty standard for mortgages in the early 80s. Yeah,
right.
It was terrible.
So when I look at it and I'm like, oh my gosh, interest rates. She's like, shut the fuck up. Exactly. And I think like there's just such a world of difference being, 5 or 6 years old when, your parents have to sell your house and become renters and move to the suburbs and all of that sort of thing versus, no, that's all happening right as you're getting born. You have this is the case for my brother. He has no memory of that stuff. And his real kind of
coming of age memories are during the Clinton years. You know, it's the longest peacetime economic expansion in U.S. history, and it's rising tides lifting all boats. But it's also, if you work hard and play by the rules, blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
And
like
the kind of, you know, all of that
neoliberalism was like so shiny and beautiful during that time, right?
Yes.
And then you get to the 2000s, you're like, oh shit. And it's like the Iraq War was started under false pretenses. And we have this giant economic collapse, right? But I think it's such a good point, too, about where you are in the generational span, right? And where your parents are, too, in terms of like, you know, I graduated from college in 2003. And if I would have taken a slightly different route, like a lot of my peers, they were pretty well established in jobs. Slightly well established in jobs, I would say, when the financial market or when the financial collapse hit, right? So some of them were definitely affected by like first in, first out. Some of them were in law school at the time, and that screwed things up in various other ways. But it's very different than like my partner who graduated into 2008, right? Like,
that, very different.
And the realities. And I think actually it shifted some things for millennials, understanding of like, how much, like, is it okay to live in your parents' basement? Because I think elder millennials are very much were raised by these parents who said, like, you will not be like those slacker Gen Xers. Like, you will not live in our basement. And then you get you get a couple years into the generation. It's like, I don't know what else is going to happen. Like, I don't know where else they're going to go.
Yes. Yeah, that feeling of, you know, the hits just keep on coming, I think might be one of the things that actually, in fairness to boomers and millennials, they have in common. Like, depending on when you're born in the boomer cohort, you may be graduating from college straight into kind of an early 70s recession.
Totally.
You may be coming of age during Watergate and the point in time where it becomes abundantly clear that depending on your draft number, you're dead. And like, you know, like but the beginning of that was all kind of up and to the right, right? There's sort of this feeling of, again, post-war economic expansion, lots of opportunity. You'll be the second generation to go to college. You know, all of those kinds of, those senses of possibility were suffused, again, mostly in white, middle-class, college-bound boomers. But then it's like, and then you get, you know, the end of the Carter administration, the beginning of the Reagan years, you get, you know, all of the kinds of, you know, what was it, 87 or 89? There was like an October stock market crash that was just devastating. My dad worked in tech, so of course he immediately lost his job. Like, that kind of cycle of things was, I think, an onslaught for a lot of boomers who did not have generational wealth. Yeah. And I think one of the things that I find the most interesting is, you know, by the time you get to the boomer generation, the sort of phenomenon of pensions and longevity in a single career at a single employer, that's gone. Yeah. Like, you know, that's long gone.
But it's
mega trends of the 80s is like,
it's familiar enough that even as it is so clearly atrophies before their eyes, you know, it's like the story is still robust enough.
Yes.
Right. And I think like that's what's always so difficult, I think, to understand, no matter which generation you are in, is that like the story is changing before our eyes of like our financial reality, our social reality. But when you have a narrative of how things are, like it is so hard to let go of. And that's true, as we've been talking about with millennials. And I think it was true with boomers too, right? Like boomers are like, we've been screwed in these various ways, but like, we're still so strong, or like, you know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah. Still some sort of hanging on to the idea of we'll change things.
Right. And like,
we will any minute now.
You know, I think on board with many of the ideas of Reaganism, or in their slightly watered down form in Clintonism, right? Like that. Yeah. Whether it's trickle down economics or it's just the idea that like deregulation will create more robust competition, which will be better for us.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the other thing I'm curious about is, you know, I think there's a lot then that millennials and boomers have in common. There's also a lot of antagonism about that. The okay boomer meme,
Yep.
the housing would be cheaper if the boomers would just surrender their homes. And, as someone with a boomer widow for a mother, I'm like, and what are we going to do with her?
Right.
Right. First of all, she's not in she's a renter now because of 2008, we lost that house. So, what are we going to, where do you want them to go? And the current kind of state of things with interest rates being where they are, boomers are now kind of locked into their houses if they're not going to sell them.
Yep.
Until interest rates come back down because they can't afford to buy something else, many of them. Many of them don't have pensions. Many of them don't have meaningful retirement savings. And we just kind of elide that and talk about the rich ones.
Yep. And many of them actually have like student loans that they've taken out for their kids or their grandkids, right? Like there is an incredible indebtedness amongst the boomer generation. Mm-hmm. But I think like there is a big swath of boomers who are just like doing great.
Yeah.
And that we have to, as much as we want to complicate the narrative, and I do think it's like very important to complicate, like there's just the ability to have saved as long as they have saved, right? Had their, like if you had a modicum of wealth and stability, like, and didn't get screwed by the financial crisis, like if you had enough equity in your home and hadn't taken out a mortgage then, like, or hadn't like been duped into a reverse mortgage, that sort of thing, like, there, and I think that there's a lot of I understand the guarding against precarity that happens, which is like, oh, I could retire, but like, what if I just work a couple more years, right? Like, there's still that same sort of like, I should work as long as I possibly can. That style of work ethic, which makes it harder for other people to move up in different fields. Like, I just like everyone is so precarious now, or afraid of precarity.
Yeah, even if they're not, they feel like they're. This, I think, is a really interesting thing because one of the things I am trying to unpack more and more as we look at these kinds of stories is what things are essentially a result of policy. Yeah, you get rid of employer-backed pensions, you implement Section 401k, and now boomers have a reason to feel that they're more precarious. Like my mother is constantly talking about how her retirement fund is down, and I'm like, unless you have made some really weird choices, there's no way. And the reason I know there's no way is like the stock market's been up. Yeah. Right? So like, if you're just doing an index fund, it should be net up, but I know what's going on. It's that she only looks when the market goes down.
Yes.
So like that's the reinforcing story there. But the other story was something that was very prevalent in the mid 80s, was stories as boomers were getting into their 30s and 40s about how they were not saving enough for retirement and they did not have pensions anymore. And so they were not going to survive retirement and needed to work longer. It's when the conversations about raising the retirement age also began. And you have the same thing with millennials of like, well, you really have to buy a house, but here's a housing market crash. Here's increased interest rates jacked up by the Fed because we're worried about a recession. All of these kinds of things are just like counter winds, or crosswinds coming at you at all times as you're trying to get where you're trying to go. And yet you still have the story of I should be here by now. Right. And that kind of received precarity is like every generation gets their version of it, except I think that like the latchkey kids are just like, whatever, it's up to you.
I think like in the bad advice or like the advice that doesn't take current realities into account. Like I remember being told again and again, like, oh, you should start putting some money into like a 401k when I was taking out so much money in student loans at like much higher interest rates, right? Like that's bad advice. And I just like, there was no one who could understand, like all of the adults in my life could not understand what student loan culture at that point was like. Like, I think people thought, oh, it's just a couple $1,000s that you're taking out in student loans instead of, oh, if you want to go to grad school now, like there is no funding mechanism except for at the Ivy League schools that covers all of your cost of living. So you essentially have to take out loans for cost of living. Or like, and my mom gave me advice to like consolidate my loans when I graduated from grad school. And it was the advice that she knew. And it, like, I think it's pretty straightforward advice. But I consolidated them at like 8%, right?
Right.
And we didn't know what the market was going to do, like, but still, like, that was a rate to lock yourself in at that I'm still dealing with now.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are really interesting implications for that. One of the, I haven't looked in the last 6 months, but about 6 months ago, I read a piece that was saying that basically millennials now, as a generation, have more in retirement savings at this stage of their lives than their parents had at the same stage.
Yeah.
They're behind in home ownership, but they're ahead in retirement savings.
But doesn't that make sense?
Yeah, because that was the advice you got.
Well, no, but also,
you can afford the house, but you can't afford.
You can sock money away into your 401k, especially if you're lucky enough to have a company that's matching, right? But like many millennials are living in housing markets where there's no access to the sort of house that they want, right? Like it's like, you can enter in the housing market if you buy a studio apartment. But you're like, I have 2 kids. I can't buy. Like, I don't, I can either move to the suburbs and maybe I don't want that for various reasons, or I can buy, or I can rent, right? Yep. And the buying options are not available. So where does your accumulated savings go besides childcare? It goes to your 401k. So like that to me, and that's like one of those things that's going to be so interesting as we see like the character of millennials continue to develop. But then there's a whole bunch of people who don't have access to 401ks because they've been part of the generalized freelancification. I didn't even know what, like, until I got an accountant, which I would advise anyone who freelances to, like, you just got to pay for an accountant to talk about solo 401ks, like all of the ways that you can start socking away money, partial amounts of your money and having tax benefits from it, even if you're a freelancer.
Yeah.
And I think that like, because if we don't account for that, so much more of the industry is moving in that direction. You're going to have people who are otherwise making good money, but who have no automated mechanism to save that money at in tax advantage ways. Yeah. Look at me using words like tax advantaged. Oh my God. But it's because I was just having a conversation with my accountant.
I mean, this sends me down all sorts of rabbit holes about, like, you know, it's sometime in the late 80s when they decided to close the bankruptcy exception that allowed you to discharge student loan debt in personal bankruptcy. Yep. You still can, but like the hoops you have to jump through are insane. And most people just give up and don't try. And the conventional wisdom is you can't. Like you technically can, but the conventional wisdom is you can't. Yep. And then at the same time, like that was sort of, it felt like, okay, that's like 96, I want to say 96 or 7 is when that happens. And it feels a little bit like, don't let the Gen Xers off the hook. And then like 3 years later, they're like, oh shit, the millennials are going to college. We need to like expand Pell Grants.
Yes. Yes.
Like the total reactivity to like which children we want to privilege and which we don't. And I don't even just mean generationally, but you know, racially parents as well.
We need to, we also need to expand the ability for middle class parents to access these student loans, which they wouldn't necessarily have needed the access to before. And this is also around the time, I'll have to look up the specific dates, when they decide like they're going to expand significantly the amount of money you can take out as a graduate student. Like basically has no cap in some ways, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is to capture, I mean, it captures all sorts of people, but it like allows all sorts of people who would look at the cost of a master's degree that wouldn't necessarily lead to employment and say, well, of course I can do that, right? Because I can cover all the costs. Whereas before it would have been cost prohibitive if you weren't wealthy or if you weren't employed by an organization that would subsidize the cost, which is like, that's how, you know, MBAs still do it, right?
Yeah.
And we also used to do lots of education that would make you better at your job inside of the organization, right? It was funded by the organization itself. And now we've outsourced it and put the costs onto the individual. But so like that made it possible for a whole generation of millennials in particular, but also I think includes Gen X and now Gen Z, to think of grad school as the answer to our problems. And it is not.
Well, it's an interesting, as you're saying this, I'm reminded of, as I was getting ready to go to, I did my undergrad, I guess, where you went to graduate school. I graduated from U of O. The advice I got was don't spend a don't spend too much money. I was in state, whatever.
Yep.
So don't spend too much money on the undergraduate degree. The brand of where you got your undergrad degree is not important. If it really matters where you went to school, it'll matter where you go to graduate school.
I also got some of that wisdom, and it's not good wisdom. Anyway.
Yes. But yeah, like, and one of the things that I think was also received wisdom, particularly for white middle-class parents, boomer parents, was the thing you're actually paying for when you go to Harvard Business School or whatever is the network.
Yep.
It's not the quality of the education, it's all the people you're going to meet that are going to give you all of these opportunities.
Yep.
And so I did the obvious thing, which is I went to Cardozo Law School and then I never practiced law. So that really paid off for me.
Going to University of Texas for my PhD has somehow not connected me with all of those MBAs who went and had a much nicer building than anyone else on campus.
Right. Yes.
My network of also slightly impoverished PhDs. It's not
which is
out for me.
Sort of the life of a PhD, it seems like anymore. That's actually a really interesting thing. Just as a quick aside, like a couple of years ago, I was doing this little project about alternative careers in the advertising industry. And I was talking to people who were older than me and how, people of color in particular had navigated such a white industry.
Yep.
And two things struck me straight away. And one is just like, you do not get to back into advertising if you're a Black woman.
No.
You need to go to VCU Brand Center and you need to get the gray advertising internship. And then you need to go work at whatever. Like there is a very specific
You have
path.
to use your credentials. Like those credentials are your entree.
Yes. Yes.
Your entree in a way that other people can just be like, oh, I just like started to get interesting. And then like my friend's dad like got me a job, right? Like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. And, but the other interesting thing was there was a period of time, again, like in the 80s in advertising where there was like, the strategist types had PhDs in anthropology and sociology and psychology. And then the industry went, no. That's too highbrow. And like, there are no PhDs in advertising. I mean, it's
there like Dr. Faye in Mad Men, right? Like she's yes, like that style.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It was Dr. Faye and then no more Dr. Faye. No more Dr. Faye
for Don Draper either. So it makes sense.
Yes.
Don Draper's like, eh.
Well, what seemed to happen was sometime in the late 70s, early 80s, we just decided that PhDs were unnecessary, but English accents will do. And so we'll just hire usually guys with English accents to be planners. No offense to my English planner friends and my English husband downstairs. So I feel like we're just kind of getting the rehash of this stuff for Gen Z and the, whatever we're going to call Gen Alpha or whatever we're going to call them after that. Are you seeing something different? Like, how are the narratives evolving for Gen Z? I feel like they also got to be digital natives. They also get to be, optimistic maybe. But sometimes I feel like the thing I'm detecting more is a kind of parallel between X and Z. There's kind of a just get on with it.
Yeah,
attitude.
I think there's like that's the pretty straightforward. Like it's so clear that these kids were often raised by Gen Xers and like they're just chiller. Like they have more inclusive body ideals, like it's just like that is that somehow that's like the more, I don't know, social justice oriented under like Gen X values trickling down. And like I see some of that. But at the same time, I'm more interested, I think, in what I see Gen Z actually expressing, not in terms of like, there's a lot of fetishization of millennial culture. And specifically like pre-internet millennial culture. And that is, I think, what differentiates elder millennials and middle millennials too from Gen Zers is that like we have a memory of a different way of being, right? Of like a very different orientation to the world, to the things that we consume. Like our points of access were very different. We lived through this incredible moment of change in the way that we communicate and the way that we consume. And also have many of the skills that we refined before we had smartphones, right? And I think a lot of millennials are very bad at like getting on the phone, right? Or like we have some very bad habits, but at the same time, I think that there is a capacity, a more just like the muscle memory of like, okay, I'm going to leave my phone in the other room for many hours at a time.
Right.
I'm going to go on an errand and I'm not going to take my phone. Right. Like there's that, like that capacity is there. And obviously Gen X has that and boomers have it for sure. Right. And different generations are also skilled at different things. Like I think boomers are very good at like just visiting in a way that other generations are not as good at it.
Yes.
Like this hang doesn't have to have a purpose or a theme. We can just be
I know.
having some coffee.
Yes. These are the times when I'm like 4 hours later, I'm still on the phone with my mom and I'm like,
yeah, exactly. Like, we're just visiting. We're having a visit. And I think that like, so what I see on TikTok in like Tumblr screenshots, like all sorts of things like that is like, it's not just an aesthetic nostalgia, which I think is how sometimes like Y2K fashion is positioned. It's like, oh, they want that. And then millennials are like, oh, like, you don't even know. This made me feel so bad about my body. And yes, it did. Like Y2K fashion did. But what they are also aspiring to is like a different way that people related to celebrities, how many images of celebrities that they saw, like the access that you had was very mediated and very in different ways. Like something like coming home and watching TRL is a different experience of music and like of commonality. I think that there can be nostalgia for. Do I think that like the diversity of music and of like taste and like just different ways of being in the world that are available to younger people today, that is superior? Like, yes, absolutely. I grew up in a tiny town in Idaho. Like there were so few representations of different ways of being. But at the same time, it was also fun to have more of those like in-person communal experiences, right? Or like non-mediated experiences, or, you know, only being able to take 24 pictures on your Vivitar.
Yeah.
Like
Vivitar, sorry. I was like, wow, the logo flashed right in front of my face.
There. Mine was a telephoto. It was like, do you want here or here? Those are your two choices. It wasn't even a Zoom.
No.
And like taking your film to Safeway and getting it developed and then getting it picked up.
Costco,
and then like doubles. And then who do you give them to? Like all those parts of material culture, there is something really wonderful about it. And like millennials are nostalgic about it for the same reason that younger generations who haven't experienced it fetishize it. So I think like paying attention to that and thinking about how can you offer, I'm just thinking from like an advertising point of view, how can you offer experiences like that?
Oh, I'm sorry to report. The people in my industry are so excited about even more like automated, generative, non-authentic experiences.
Yeah, like no one wants like the AI simulation of bringing your like I don't need to virtually bring my roll of film to the store. I want to actually bring my roll of film to the store.
Like I am literally tomorrow moderating a panel for a digital product studio with like people from from Meta and Intuit and various other places talking about emotive AI, creating breakthrough customer experiences with generative AI. And part of my role in all of these things is always to be the one going, really? Is this a thing people want?
Like,
or is this
how
just a toy you want to play with?
Yeah, how can you make it not be that?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's interesting to me, right? It's like, how do you cut through the idea that people always like, how can we make this more automated? How can we make this more like CGI feeling, and get to the heart of like what an actual authentic experience feels like? And it has nothing to do usually with like the surface level aesthetics of it.
So this leads me to another thing, which I think you teed up in our emails back and forth, which was about this kind of optimism, pessimism kind of dynamic.
Yeah.
And this is of interest to me because we did a small survey, not particularly scientific, a couple of summers ago of 18 to 24-year-olds, asking them about their optimism and then also kind of how they, or pessimism, and how they kind of see their life shaping up over the next 10-ish years.
Oh my gosh.
And
18 to 22-year-olds in the last few years, like, whew.
Yes. Well, and it was brought about because we were doing higher education related research in the midst of the pandemic. And we added in some 17, 18-year-olds into the mix just out of curiosity to see what was going on with them. It was mostly for returning education. But there were several people that said things to the effect of, and one person said this explicitly, the thing that they had learned from the pandemic was that actually no one cares whether you live or die.
Yeah.
And that made me go, if that is and it is a reasonable thing for you to feel, if that is a thing that you are feeling at 18 years old, what does that mean for your sense of what's possible for the future?
Yeah.
Like to just feel like you're on your own, live, die, nobody cares.
Yep.
And I'm curious about that. And the nostalgia thing made me think about it because I am also kind of obsessed with what's going on in nostalgia and the way that marketers in particular are trying to exploit the kind of nostalgic moment we've been dwelling in for a while.
Yep.
And I think there's something like, there's optimism, there's pessimism, and then nostalgia kind of smothers both of them in a blanket. And I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with a question about that, but I'm just curious about, do you think that there are optimistic generations and pessimistic generations? Are they kind of constantly toggling between the two? Or are they just sort of living in tension? What are you seeing?
Well, I mean, we were talking about this earlier, right? That elder millennials, and I'd say middle millennials, like grew up during this time that was like, strongest economy for the longest amount of time. 9/11 shattered some of that, but then also created this feeling of like nationalism that felt very optimistic. It's hard to talk, like people who didn't live through it, it's hard to recover that moment, but it was incredibly tragic, but also like a very different feeling than what I would say, like how Americans feel about their government right now. Right. And so I think that like many millennials were raised with a feeling of optimism about the future. Like, and even like, and were effectively sold narratives that flattened the realities of like how much more pessimistic we should be. Right. So even though we're not doing anything about climate change and like, the way that our government is set up makes it so that it's very hard to do things like instill regulation that would change direction on like gas cars, all sorts of things, right? It's like the narrative is like, oh, well, we're closing the hole in the ozone. Like we did that. That was like, I remember that so vividly from when I was like, I don't know, probably around 10, 11, 12 was this a narrative of like, we fixed it. You stopped using Aquanet and like there were some studies and we did it, guys.
Yes. Yes.
And I think also we weren't living through a moment at that period in time of such like dramatic climate instability too. So it was like, oh, global warming is just an idea, less a reality that was faced, and it was also less polarized. So it was easier to maintain that optimism for longer. I mean, I think I don't want to compare different styles of pessimism, but don't you think it's like more tragic in some ways to be someone who thought that the world was good and then you're like, oh, wait, everything's really bad? Or is it worse to always think that everything's really bad, to like go through middle school under Trump, right? And to live with that reality and that understanding of how like representative democracy doesn't work. And what's going on with like the Supreme Court. Like if you're a 16-year-old girl, you know what's going on with the Supreme Court. Like, you know.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing I think that's been extremely troubling to me of late, and it's probably a whole other episode, but it's like the thing I hadn't fully thought through until some recent polling data about this is who's president, what the shape of the political parties are when you kind of come into your votership, matters a lot. Like your perception of these brands matters a lot.
Yep.
People's politics tend to track more or less to their parents' politics, their community's politics. And so if you're coming of age in the Trump administration and your parents are Republicans, you think this is normal. Like you don't know the McCain era even.
Right.
Like you don't know what it was like, whatever, when there was some sort of idea that bipartisanship was a value that could ever be achieved. And that, I mean, even just the idea of like, there's no meaningful difference between the political parties. Like,
which was the reality.
That's over.
The first election that I remember is 1988. And it was like Dukakis and Bush Sr., right? And there wasn't enormous differences. Like the polarization just wasn't there, right? And you had a lot more compromise. Yeah. So this is, and if this is your reality, right? And that the Supreme Court does stuff all the time that is not in line with how the rest of the nation believes.
Not only is not in line with the way the rest of the nation believes, but that like law professors are apoplectic trying to figure out how to teach law right now. Yes. Because all the things that they're used to teaching you, this court is like, YOLO.
Right. Because like, sometimes I feel like I have to be careful because something like Brown versus Board was not necessarily in line with what many Americans believed, but was still the right thing. Right. And I think it like also built on precedent to some extent, or legal precedent, whereas now a lot of these rulings are not built. Like it's not just that the Supreme Court is unpopular. It's that it's also not built on precedent. And like I think like the reality, if you are an incoming voter right now, is that your vote doesn't matter. You know what I mean?
I mean, that has been obviously like a pretty profound narrative for a long time. And there's a dude I know who's an older boomer who's like that. I tried to argue that point with him once and he was just like, no, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Your vote does not count. And it was just like, and this guy works in politics, so I don't really know how he organizes his life. but that view, I think, has kind of metastasized because it's not just that like your vote is one amongst many, or you live in a place that's gerrymandered, or you live in a place where it's just going to go blue anyway. It's also that like even if you vote, there's all these other things that are supposed to be counterweights that aren't counterweights anymore. And
like imagine trying to explain the Electoral College to someone who thinks we live in democracy, right? You're like, okay, so every year one person wins by millions and millions of votes, and it's a very clear victory, but that person sometimes doesn't win. And every year we have to be very, very scared that they're going to win. Yes. And also because of the way that the Senate works, like we can't change anything about the way that like the rest of the government works. So like we're very ossified in this way. And that I think like and I do think that the younger generation who came through middle school and high school under Trump, like they learned that government is a crisis, is an ongoing crisis, and that their parents are mad about it all the time. Right. And
regardless of which side their parents are on.
Yes. Right. That like listening to NPR is not like
it's not calming.
Which is, I just remember my mom would pick me up from like piano practice and drive home. This is like the most like bourgeois as Idaho bourgeois as you can get. But picking me up from piano practice and driving home and just like NPR just quietly in the background. So calming, right? It's not.
Yes. Not anymore.
No. Yeah.
No.
And so if that's your reality.
I don't even know if they can like market driveway moments anymore, which used to be the thing.
Just driveway anger.
It's driveway anger. Exactly. At all times. I guess I had a different question for you, but you teed this up at the beginning. I just want to ask you about it briefly. And that is this perimenopause stuff. And the TikTok memes of Gen Zers saying that they think they're aging faster than millennials, and then the millennial women who just turned 42 and are convinced that they're on the cusp of menopause. Like they just delivered their third child, and now it's like, I'm clearly menopausal. And I'm like, it's possible. It's also possible you're postnatal. Like, there's a lot of things that could be going on. You're also just in your 40s now.
Yeah.
But like, it does feel like the moment is skincare tweakments, perimenopause, and everybody's very concerned about getting old rapidly, which is extremely funny when then you read like the works of Jean Twenge, who thinks that everything is bad because we're now doing slow living stuff because it takes forever for people to die, so it takes forever for people to mature. And I'm like, okay, but now it feels like there's this compressed timeline of like, you get to be an adult, you have fun for 5 minutes, and now it's just slouching towards the grave.
Yeah. No, I mean, I do think that there is more stress on our bodies for various reasons than there has been. I think that like, especially in the United States, I think that with like the demands, and I would say that this is more true of women stereotypically than men. Like, obviously we also were very hard on our bodies when we were, when more of us were manually laboring all of the time. But I think like the way that we labor in and outside of the home creates a lot more labor, and that like accumulative labor, and that we also are incredibly bad at resting. And that includes because of like, we need to make more money, or we like there's no end point, right? Like there's always more money that you could be making, or a compulsion to feel productive and that you can't rest, or our devices really make it hard to achieve rest, right? So like the way that we relate to those devices means that we're getting such worse sleep, right? Or when we are going on a walk, or like things that would actually reset our brain and make it so that our brains can rest more, so that our anxiety levels can go down, all of these different things, like they are interrupted by our devices. So we're never actually achieving that respite, that recuperation that is so necessary for a healthy body and mind.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think our bodies are wearing down in a way that like would be more appropriate to someone who is laboring outside all of the time, right? Like just like we are really hard on our bodies, and I think like the stress of parenting in the world also makes it so that people use substances in a way that maybe they wouldn't otherwise use substances. Like it's just all cumulative. And so maybe one way to try to explain like, oh, why do I feel like shit all the time is maybe I'm starting perimenopause.
Right.
I don't think that it's fake. Like, I want to be very clear that like lots of people are experiencing things that like, because we haven't talked about these things publicly for very long, that like they're real. Lots of people are experiencing these things. But then I also think that we are often trying to find a solution to the never answered question of why do I feel like shit all the time?
Yeah. Well, and I think if you can come up with a diagnosis, then theoretically you can come up with a treatment when,
right.
You know, like that might help. And it also might, I mean, I did some work on hormone replacement therapy for men a few years ago. And I interviewed a lot of endocrinologists and so on and patients. And it was like, men experience something like a menopause. They experience something where they are exhausted all the time, and their sex drive dips, and their self-image changes, and their self-esteem changes, and all of those things happen kind of simultaneously. And they're just really hoping that like testosterone will do the trick. And the endocrinologists are like, most of the time when we actually test people's testosterone levels, they're low in a way that is normal for their age and is probably not the cause of their problems. Probably, you know, they have other stress issues. They could use a therapist. They could use to, you know, tend to lose a little weight. They could get more rest. Like all of those kinds of things.
They need a hobby. That's not their job.
A hobby. You know, friendships with people other than people they share with their home with, you know, those kinds of things that men sadly don't really get socialized to do necessarily. And so, you know, I understand, you know, obviously there is also the part where menopause is this thing that you just sort of silently suffer through and you don't know anything about it and until you're in it. And even then you don't know anything about it except what you're experiencing.
Yep.
And it is good to be having these conversations now, but I do have a few friends where I'm like, I think you're jumping the gun. I think you just are really tired.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but
and
then
it's hard to solve that.
Combine all of that too with like incredible distrust with our medical systems and like the difficulty in getting into a doctor even, or having it covered by insurance. Like I think that there's just there's just a big hunger to like figure out what's wrong. And like you said, like if I can figure out what's wrong, then I can fix it. And that idea to me is actually very millennial. And I'm guilty of it all the time. Is like, if I can just diagnose it, if I can just pinpoint the idea, then if I work hard enough, I can fix it. Whereas I think that like some other people from other generations that I know are like, my body's just broken. Like,
right. Well, I think that's actually really interesting. I think like that is like a growing up in the age of having names for things.
Yeah.
That instead of just like that kid in the classroom who can't sit still and he's a pain and he's always in trouble and he's constantly being sent to the principal's office. Oh no, he has ADHD and he needs to be on medication for that. Yeah. And he needs a classroom aide to attend to him throughout the day. Like that shift of, it's not just like, I don't know, he's kind of a pain in the ass, to, oh no, he has a condition and needs to be on, a protocol for that, is, I think, something that's very, I have my crotchety Gen X moments where I'm just like, I have ADHD. I have been on medication for it. I'm currently not on medication for it for a variety of other reasons. But like, I simultaneously sometimes are like, I'm not sure that you guys have ADHD. I think you live in this world and that this world makes everyone feel like prioritizing is hard and directing your attention is difficult. And I used to be really skeptical of that idea of like, because it was like, oh, it's the MTV generation was the original critique of ADD diagnoses. Right. And it's like, that I think was bullshit, but the device problem is a real problem.
Totally.
And
yeah. How do you like, this is what I find myself doing all the time, especially with like the current discourse on like kids and devices, and like, how do you be like, yeah, these things are breaking our brains, but also stop freaking out, right? Like,
yes. Yes.
Like, how do you balance those two things? And I think about that, like as a non-parent,
the Jonathan Haidt of it all.
I have a little bit of distance to be able to be like, this thing that you're obsessing with overparenting, like we're gonna be fine, right? Like really, just they need to be bored more. Like that's always my like general advice is like teach kids to be bored more. But I also like everything is more complicated, right? Like there are things that are awesome about what we're worrying more about, right? Like things that we're more attentive to when it comes to raising kids. And then there are things that you're like, okay, we can worry less about this thing. And I think instead of balancing, it's more like we should worry about all the things all the time. And that's exhausting too.
That is exhausting. But I think it leads me to my last question, which is, it's sort of a question I ask a lot of people, is about the kind of utility of these generational frames. I've been thinking about the stuff this week I've been doing about student loans as culture, and it is, and it is a cross-generational thing. It is not getting better; it's getting worse. Like it is a thing unto itself that like we can talk about how it evolved and which waves of people were affected in which ways by it, and how that changes people's expectations and all of that sort of thing. But like the problem's the student loans. The problem is the cost of tuition. Right, the problem's not millennials.
Totally. Yeah, and we should have better conversations about it, but also we should change the policy. And but they're all interrelated, right? And that's what like my guest on that episode, Dominique Baker, is so smart about. Like part of the reason the policy hasn't been changed is because we haven't had better conversations about it, right? And so how do we do both? That's always
and that I think comes back to what we were saying at the beginning about the class distinctions and how in these narratives about, I mean, it's in Jonathan Haidt's work, it's in Jean Twenge's work, it's in Scott Galloway's commentary about stuff, which is like, I actually did a flash survey just to respond to Scott saying that he does not believe that people would make decisions about where to go to college based on the state's abortion laws. And when we did that survey, we found that people who are planning to go to college in the next year, they are concerned about actually two things. The top one is actually gun laws.
Yeah.
They are concerned about gun safety in the place that they're going to go to college, which makes sense because you've been doing active shooter drills since you were 5, but you haven't been doing like active repro care drills since you were 5.
Right.
So like it's clear and present and it seems like a thing that could kill you. But the all else equal question of like, if it's as good a school as any place else, and it's not a question of where you got in and all of that sort of stuff. A state that has a 6-week abortion ban, a state that doesn't, they're going to pick the state that doesn't. And both men and women, more women than men, but both men and women said that. And it was just kind of like, that was part one. Part two was, I just know when he's talking about college kids, he's picturing an upper middle class white kid from New Jersey who's going to go to Penn.
Right.
And like, that's not who goes to college. First year college students on average are like 25-year-old women of color who are the first in their generation to go to school.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, they care about access to healthcare.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, sorry, they just do.
And that is the, like, when we talk about the amount of student debt loans, like the people with these astronomical amounts, the people who had as much as I had in student loans, that is incredible. Like, that's not typical. But even though the average number is lower, it's still like, it all depends on like your ability to pay it, right? Your ability to pay it regularly, your ability to consolidate, like whether or not you had to take out private loans, whether or not, you took out those loans in order to go to a for-profit university and like couldn't finish your degree, whether you finished your degree at all. Like, it's all of this incredible intersectional data that is often not taken into account. And I, Dr. Baker always, like, we were talking about how the school and like the paradigm that is often bandied about is, the upper middle class white kid who goes to Penn, or just Harvard, like as an institution. When the amount, like the number of institutions that function like Harvard is so infinitesimally small, instead of talking about like, oh, here's how it works at like the local community college. Or the,
we're completely up in arms about, completely up in arms about 50 kids at Yale, but like not at all concerned about what's going on at Portland State.
Which is like, which is much more representative of what's going on at college. Much more. So,
I think like, my desire is that we could from time to time, because I think the other thing that happens, and this is true of a lot of Haidt's work and others, is like things kind of get twisted really fast, right? Like even the coddling of the American mind is like my standing one-liner about this is like, who did the coddling?
Always. I'm like, who gave those trophies? Who did it?
Yeah, exactly. Like, you cannot point at the kids who've been coddled and say it's your fault. Like,
no,
they didn't coddle themselves, like assuming that they were coddled. But the same thing is true here, where it's like, the kind of prescription about being anxious is like, I'm going to find 2 charts that have about the same shape, and I'm going to go see this one causes that one. And that's the answer.
Yeah.
And there's so much of that. Like, there's so much of that in the world I come from. There's so much of that in the public discourse and in like ideas, books in general. And the kind of idea of like, well, it went up really steeply in 2012. And that was when widespread adoption of smartphones happened. It's like a lot of things happened in 2012.
Yes.
I mean, a whole lot of things happened in 2012.
If I think about
there's a
all
lot
the
of things
ways
to feel anxious
that,
about.
My life has changed since 2012, right? And how much of it didn't have to do with the cell phone. It's just there with everything else too. But
Anyway, well, I know we've kind of gone over
this
time.
Is super fun.
This was so fun.
I could talk. If you're a game, I would love to have you on my podcast. We can talk about something like at the intersection of your interests in some way. But I think that my listeners would really like it.
Oh, that'd be fun. Since I can keep talking about this, obviously forever.
And I have an upcoming episode about generational nostalgia that I'm talking with someone who does more of that kind of like straightforward, like why, like the cultural component, like, so why are we rebooting these specific texts? Like, what's going on there? But I think that we could find somewhere that we could
That'd be great. I really want to listen to that. Just as a quick aside, like we're working on, my company is working on developing, we're still like prototyping the first one. And the first one will be about nostalgia, but I don't know, you probably have come across trend reports in your day.
Yeah.
And they are my least favorite thing in the advertising industry because they're usually made up. And even when they're not made up, they are not super thoughtful. And so the kind of...
Yeah. Just the focus, like the conversations I've had with ad agencies who like they've paid me to consult. And they're like, what do you see happening in this space, in the wellness space? And I'm like, what are your predictions, your trend? So if they're building on things like those conversations, then yes, they always seem bad to me.
Yes. And, when I first started working in ad agencies in like 99, 2000, and you'd have like Mr. Youth come and present about what the cool new trends were. And you'd be like, those are 100 kids at FIT. No one else is doing that. But the other thing about it is like the desire for prediction is huge. It's actually one of the things that we didn't get to in this conversation is just like, Jean Twenge is really explicit about it in her writing of like, if we can understand people when they're young, we'll understand them when they're old. And it's like, you want to make predictions and you are not doing the work of understanding the present. And this is the problem that we have here. And so the thing we're working on is not a trend report, a trend warning label. So they are like, here's a trend. Here's what you need to know about the trend. Here's the dangers of the trend. Here's where it's appropriate and where it's not appropriate. And nostalgia is the first one that we've been working on. So I will actively look out for your nostalgia episode because...
Amazing.
It's wild out there. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you
so much
this is great.
for the time. This is great.
In the Demo is written and hosted by Farrah Bostic and Adam Pierno, with support from the Difference Engine. Edited by Allison Preisinger and Amp Studio, with production support from Ashley Darrington. Music used with permission by Omega Man under the Creative Commons license. Go to inthedemopodcast.com for behind-the-scenes research, supporting information, and transcripts. If you'd like to support the show, please rate, review, and share the show with people you think will appreciate it. Thanks for listening.